exercise the power that was within. What are your thoughts on this? And do you have any further information on what instructions were made at the school as to why the documentation wasn't published?
Well, the first rule of Power Grab Club is don't talk about Power Grab Club. And Scott Morrison broke that rule today. Scott Morrison was evasive, he was defensive, he was passive-aggressive, and of course he was self-serving. So at least he was true to himself today. What we saw was all of his characters on full display, blaming everyone else, not accepting any responsibility, saying, for example, that somehow when he said he was taking the decision on the resources as Resources Minister, when he said, I'm making this decision as Prime Minister, everyone should have known at that point in time somehow that he had sworn himself in as the Resources Minister in order to make that decision. His extraordinary comments that he said, where he gave a press conference and said that he made the conscious decision to not tell his cabinet colleagues that he had also occupied their space as Treasurer, as Finance Minister, as Industry, Science, Energy and Resources Minister, as Home Affairs Minister, that somehow he didn't want it to be misinterpreted, which is why he didn't tell anyone. The fact is there were at least 3 documents provided. The Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, I wrote to them today asking that in the public interest, after questions have been raised with the Department and with myself at yesterday's press conference, that it be released, the documentation of appointment signed by the Governor-General. Those documents have now been released. Why there wasn't any statement made at the time is incomprehensible to me. It is a government not being transparent, and this was a shadow government. It's one thing to have a shadow ministry. This was a shadow government, so that Josh Frydenberg and Matthias Cormann and Karen Andrews and others weren't even told, nor were the secretaries of departments like Treasury and Home Affairs. So that when the incident occurred on May 21, where you had that release of the text messages about at the arrival of a boat, Karen Andrews, who'd got the phone call, according to her, from Scott Morrison asking for a release to be made in breach of what had been the government policy, including under Minister Morrison when he had responsibility for that. At no stage did we know that Minister Morrison had in fact been appointed as Minister for Home Affairs as well. Now, it's one thing for his ministerial colleagues to not be told, and I noticed in the part of the press conference that I watched, and I watched most of it before we began the event here today, Mr Morrison spoke about apologising to his ministerial colleagues for how they felt. Not that he'd done anything wrong, he accepted no responsibility. But how about an apology to the Australian people? The Australian people went to an election not knowing that any of this had occurred, not knowing that there was a shadow government operating in darkness without transparency, a clear misleading of the parliament whereby parliamentarians and ministers are held to account for areas in which they have responsibility. We asked questions about PEP 11, specifically in the House of Representatives, and at no stage did Minister Pitt or Prime Minister Morrison at the time say, well, actually, that was a decision made by Minister Morrison, not as Prime Minister, but as Minister for Resources.